Hello and welcome back everyone. For today's video we are going to continue our chess tournament. We are having round 8 of Norway Chess 2024 and we are having Magnus Carlsen, the 5 times World Chess Championship, faced off with Praggnanandhaa, who is a rising talent from India. Now last game we covered Praggnanandhaa crushed Magnus with a quiet aggression as we called it, and let's see for today's video who will going to be the winner. So we get pawn to d4 from Magnus, knight to f6 from Pragg, and now bishop to f4 from Magnus. Now this is the London system. For those of you who don't know the London system is where you get the bishop out and maybe build a pyramid and just develop normally, and white is solid no matter what black will do. And this is why some of players hate the London system, because it is so solid for white. So we get pawn to d5 from Magnus, pawn to e3 from Magnus, and now we get bishop to f5 from Pragg. So after bishop to f5, it is usually nice to go pawn to c4 and not pawn to c3, and Magnus did that to open up this diagonal for the queen to go out and attack that pawn on b7. So we get pawn to e6 and now knight to c3. And now we get bishop to d6 to try to challenge that bishop on f4. And we get bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and now queen to b3, immediately hitting the pawn on b7. So we get pawn to b6 defending the pawn. And now we get knight to f3 to trying to develop his pieces. Short castle, bishop to e2, finishing his development, and he is ready to castle. D takes c4, queen takes c4, and now pawn to a6. To make knight to b5 is not possible. So we get short castle from Magnus, knight b to d7, and now rook f to d1 from Magnus. We get pawn to b5 from Pragg, queen to b3, and now pawn to c5. The idea behind c5 is that black is trying to get rid of the center pawns, because he's trying to just equalize the game, make it 2-on-2 on the queen side. And yeah, there is nothing that much, and you may think that as well, that the game is so boring, why are you showing me that? But as promised, I will just show you an exciting ones, so let's see how the game goes. We get d takes c5, queen takes c5, and now knight to d4 hitting the bishop on f5. We get bishop to g6, and now we get bishop to f3 putting out the bishop on that nice diagonal. So we get rook to a7 from Pragg. Now the engine is calling rook to a7 is an inaccuracy, because the engine was thinking about bishop to h5 was a better move, because if you take the rook, I'll take the rook as well, and the game will remain equal, and we just traded our bishops. But Pragg went to rook to a7, so let's see how the game goes. Magnus goes rook to c1, he aligns the rook in the face of the queen, and now we get queen to g5 from Pragg. Pragg is trying to play an aggressive chess. Maybe that queen on g5 could later on go h5 and h4 and try to go for h3. Could also go for knight to g4 and queen to h4. Could also go for knight to e5 business. Who knows? So you get knight to c6 from Magnus, hitting the rook on a7. And now Pragg found a little nice move, which is knight to e5. Now the idea behind knight to e5, that if Magnus was a beginner and thought, okay, I'll take up the free rook, then after knight takes f3, he is immediately lost, because of course this is a check and you cannot capture the knight because the pin from the queen, so you'll have to move your king, probably something like king to h1, but knight to g4 is just such a crushing move, because you cannot take this knight, because knight takes f2 is checkmate in one move. So after knight to e5, Magnus is forced to trade the knights on e5. We get queen takes e5, and now pawn to a4 from Magnus. Magnus trying to pull out a weakness on b5 that he could try to pressure later on the game. B takes a4 from Pragg, and now we get queen to b6. Queen to b6 is hitting the rook on a7, but also at the same time Magnus is taking an advantage, because this rook cannot go to a8, and also the d file is occupied by the white's rook. Yeah, basically Magnus trying to squeeze Praggnanandhaa here. So we get queen to b8 from Pragg, defending the rook and offering a queen trade at the same time, and we get knight takes a4 from Magnus, defending his queen. Magnus saying, okay, if you want to trade, then get my knight to a better place, where also this rook cannot attack it from b7. This is why rook a7, the engine was not a big fan of it. So we get pawn to h6 from Pragg, making a loft for his king, and now we get bishop to e2, dropping back but putting pressure on the pawn on a6. We get knight to d5 from Pragg, hitting the white queen, and we get queen to d4 to keep that pawn on b2 defended. We get pawn to a5 from Praggnanandhaa, and now we get knight to c5 from Magnus. Magnus is just trying to play positionally and putting his pieces on a nice and solid square. So we get queen to b6 from Pragg, and now we get bishop to f3 back to trying to hit that strong knight on d5. And now we get rook to b8. Praggnanandhaa is trying to fire up that pawn on b2 because it is just a one-side advantage. If white can win this pawn on a5, then white is going to win, or black could win the pawn on b2, then black is just going to be winning. So here Magnus takes on d5, and now e takes d5, and now Magnus, instead of taking the pawn on d5 immediately, he just goes b3. So that pawn right now is defended with the knight, and this pawn on e4 is ready to be in d5, is ready to be captured next move. So we get rook to c7, pressurizing this knight, and now we get knight to e6. The idea behind knight to e6, it is not a blunder, of course. If you take the knight with the queen, then rook takes c7 will be winning for white, and at the same time you cannot capture the knight with the pawn, because after this queen exchange, then you will drop your rook on c7 and white will be winning the game as well. So after knight to e6, Praggnanandhaa is forced pretty much to exchange the queens on d4, and now we get knight takes d4. We get rook b to c8, stacking out the towers on the c file, and okay, Praggnanandhaa is saying, okay, I am a little bit better, I have an open c file. What are you doing, Magnus? Magnus says, okay, let's keep both rooks on the board and let's not trade anything. And he plays rook to a1, putting pressure on the pawn on a5. And now we get bishop to c2 from Pragg, hitting the rook, but also at the same time putting pressure on the pawn. We get rook d to c1. The engine is considering rook d to c1 was inaccuracy. The engine was liking, instead of rook c1, rook to f1 to try to push for f4 or f3 e4. We don't really understand engines these days, but Magnus in fact just goes rook to c1. It is considered to be an inaccuracy. So anyways, we get bishop to d3 from Praggnanandhaa, and now rook takes c7, and now pawn to f3 from Magnus. He is making a loft for his king and himself, and also f3 supports to push e4 later on the game, but also takes away the e4 square from this bishop. So we get rook to c5 from Magnus, and now we get king to f2 from Magnus. We get pawn to h5 from Pragg. Pragg is trying to fix king side pawns, but Magnus is really trying to push for a win here. So we get king to e1, and now pawn to g6 from Pragg, king to d2, and now bishop to f5 from Pragg. So Praggnanandhaa is just saying, okay, you can take my bishop and damage my structure more, but I think this will just be a draw. So Magnus thought, okay, you are thinking that this is a draw? You must be kidding me. And he just goes rook to c1. Rook takes c1, king takes c1, and for that moment it is still a draw, but we all know Magnus Carlsen, and he is a magician in the end game, and we all know that. So after king takes c1, we get bishop to d7 back, and now king to b2. Magnus trying to go for the pawn on a5. So we get king to f8, and now king to c3, king to e7 from Pragg, and now knight to e2. Maybe that knight is headed up to f4 and the king on d4. It will be a nice combination to hit the pawn on d5. So we get king to d6, and now king to d4. And now we get pawn to a4 from Pragg, trying to release off some pawns out of the board to trying to draw the game. But we get bishop takes, b takes a4, bishop takes a4, and now knight to f4 from Magnus. This is still considered to be a draw, but we will see if there is any magic or not. We cannot tell you yet. So we get bishop to b3 from Pragg, defending his pawn on d5, and now h4 from Magnus. He is fixing those pawns on the king side, because right now you cannot kick out my knight with g5, and also at the same time any push for that pawn, for the f pawn, will hang out the g6 pawn. So it is really tough position for black to play. So we get bishop to a2 from Pragg, and now pawn to g4 from Magnus, and we all see the plan right now. Magnus saying, okay, you will lose a pawn on h5, or you will trade as happens at the game, f takes g4, and I am now having a pass pawn on the h file. So what will Pragg do? Pragg panics and plays king to e7, and now knight takes d5 with check is played, king to e6 back, and now pawn to e4, just defending his knight. And this is considered to be not such an easy win for white, but let's see how it goes. So we get bishop to b3, and now knight to f4 check back, king to f6, and now pawn to g5. This is still considered to be a draw. So you must be wondering what happens. So we get king to g7 from Pragg, and now pawn to e5 from Magnus. Sorry, king to e5 by Magnus. We get bishop to c2, trying to pin up this king to defend the pawn on e4. We get knight to d5 from Magnus, and now Praggnanandhaa blunders the game with this move. Bishop to b3, bishop to d3, and bishop to d3 is a mistake. And why is that? Because right now, in this position, Magnus can go, and he plays the winning move, which is knight to f6. Now the idea behind it, that after black goes king to f8, and this as well happens at the game, that now king to d6 is going to be played, and now h5 is coming, and e5 is coming with e6, and you will lose due to a pass pawn here. Either will be the h pawn or the e pawn. We will find out shortly. So we get bishop to b1, and now king to d7. So Magnus is improving his king more and more and more. We get bishop to c2 back, so Praggnanandhaa is waiting, and we get king to d8. I don't know where is he improving his king more, but we will see. We get bishop to b1, and now knight to d7 with check, king to g7 back, and now pawn to e5. And here, this is considered to be just winning for white, but Pragg even blunders more with bishop to f5, and bishop to f5 was just the final mistake, because after king to e7, now the king is hitting up this pawn, and there is nothing much to do. In the game, Pragg went bishop to b1 back, but after knight to c5 supporting that pawn push, it is just a game over. We get bishop to c2, and we get right now knight to b7, trying to head off this knight to d6, where it could hit the pawn on f7. We get bishop to b1, knight to d6 from Magnus, and now bishop to a2, defending the pawn on f7. And now Magnus finishes off the game nicely and spectaculous with knight takes f7, sacrificing the knight. So we get bishop takes f7, and now pawn to e6, and this is just a nice endgame play by Magnus, because after bishop to g8, king to d7 was played, and believe it, right now in this position, Praggnanandhaa just resigns the game, because here black is zugzwang. A zugzwang in chess means that if you wish to pass your move to your opponent, saying to him play again, but you cannot, because of course if king to f8 is being played, then after e7 and e8 will come with check next move, so there is nothing much to do, and you cannot move your bishop. If you went bishop to f7, then this is also considered to be losing. After king to d6, you will rotate your king and go for the pawn push, and the game is immediately over. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for the upcoming rounds in Norway Chess 2024, and goodbye.